Hello, everyone, and welcome, Duke alumni and friends, to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute. This is an interdisciplinary educational program that is organized in a set of thematic courses. So thank you all for joining us today. I am Jenny Brennan. I work as a science and policy analyst for the Southern Environmental Law Center. I focus on climate change adaptation mostly, and I'm based out of the southeastern US. And it's been almost exactly 5 years since I was last a student at Duke in the Nicholas School of the Environment's Master of Environmental Management program. This is the final installation in a series of talks centered around the world of water. Today's topic, Humans and Water, the Future of America's Water, really touches all our lives, regardless of where you are in the world or how your day-to-day life unfolds. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Martin Doyle. He is a professor of river system science and policy at the Nicholas School of the Environment and the director of the water policy program at the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Martin is a stalwart of the Nicholas School and an invaluable resource as he has experience in both hands-on scientific research and also the creation and application of policy. He has published many articles and 2 books, including The Source, which tells the story of America and its rivers, and is really a natural continuation of today's conversation. From experience as his student, I know that he prefers brevity in both writing and speaking. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Martin.
Jenny, thanks so much. It's good to see you again. As Jenny said, I'm over in the Nicholas School, and I also had a joint appointment in the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. And so I think a lot about water and policy and history and all kinds of things like that. And so what the way that I wanted to set this up was to really take a step back and look at 1950. Coming out of the Depression and the Second World War, the Truman administration brought in a group of about 50 leading thinkers, government leaders, water scientists and engineers, policymakers, and they put together a report that has the ambitious title of A Water Policy for the American People. And so this was when America was coming out of these really devastating series of events, and they were casting their eyes forward into what did we want to do? What do we want to do over the next 50 years or so here in America, and how is water going to be a part of America's future? And so what I want to do is I'm going to take this report as kind of the starting point and look backwards about almost 75 years over what's happened since that report came out, and then use that as a pivot to kind of look forward of what are we going to be looking for over the next 50 to 75 years as we think about water and policy and basically water resources for the American people going forward. And to really kind of set the stage for this, the best way to kind of envision what happened are these series of graphs that are over on the left. By the way, there's going to be some graphs tonight, so kind of hang with me on a few of these. But really what happened over the 20th century, and especially the bulk of the second half of the 20th century, is we just built the bejesus out of America's water. So America's population went from about 92 million in 1900 to over 300 million at the turn of the 21st century. We went from about 7,000 to 10,000 dams in 1900 to over 85,000 dams as of 2020. The number of bridges that we had went up by almost 2 orders of magnitude. We have over 900,000 kilometers of sewer pipeline, 6 million kilometers of surface roads, along with almost 5,000 offshore oil and gas platforms. So the 20th century, especially the second half of the 20th century, was an era of building things. And really, this is encapsulated perhaps best by the big Western dam. And this is Lake Powell, which is on the Colorado River, which sits just upstream of the Grand Canyon. And this is kind of the kind of thing that we really built. And if you want to read all about the history of all these kinds of things and buy a very nice present for everyone in your family in the holidays, I go through a lot of this history in the book that I did. That's a history of America told through its rivers. But really what I wanted to kind of draw attention to is in this very prescient report from 1950, one of the things that the Presidential Commission noted was the reality that conditions were going to change. As they looked forward for 50 to 75 years, what they drew attention to was that we would be facing ever-changing conditions over a 50 to 75 or 50-year time period. And in fact, that's what we've seen. Over the past 120 years, if we look at temperature anomalies, not surprisingly, climate change has really started to demonstrate just how much conditions can change. The only place in the deep south where I'm from, the Mississippi Delta, we've actually seen a very slight cooling, but otherwise throughout the United States, we've seen increasing warming from the Southwest, which we're very familiar with. But I also want to draw attention to the fact that New England, the upper Midwest as well, are experiencing very dramatic warming trends over the past few decades on the order of about 5 degrees Celsius or 5 degrees Fahrenheit for an average temperature change for these different regions. This is a lot of temperature change that affects our water resources. Now, over this talk, I'm going to kind of pivot from these kind of national scale trends and then what does this look like locally? And given the fact that I had Jenny doing my introduction, I pulled out Jenny's master's project from 5 years ago. And she and some other students did some really nice analysis of the Yakima River Basin in Washington. And this is what climate change looks like in Yakima, Washington. So from 1985 to roughly 2020, the average winter temperature in Yakima, Washington has increased from about -5 degrees Celsius all the way up to about -1 degree Celsius. Now, this is really important because when the temperature is -5 or so, winter precipitation comes as snow, which we get free storage from that. We get a really nice snowpack and we get to basically get that free storage all the way up until May and June. But when the winter temperature is about -1, we get that really awful wintry mix. So precipitation comes as rain and sleet and kind of slushy snow, which runs off very quickly, which means that all of this precipitation that comes in the winter is not available in the summer months. Now, this basin is very important. It's not just the national place where we get most of our hops for our beer, but it's also if you eat a Honeycrisp apple or a Cosmic Crisp apple or a Gala apple, there's a really good chance that that apple was actually grown in Yakima, Washington. And so as the climate is changing in Yakima, Washington, the ability to produce some of these core crops that we increasingly depend on is going to be increasingly challenged. So this is what it looks like locally. Now, what you're going to see over the next few months is what climate change is really going to do to the Colorado Basin. And so we know that climate change has been changing the flows on the Colorado River. But really what we are seeing now is the Bureau of Reclamation and the national government, the federal government, and state governments making real-time decisions about how are they going to balance the conflicting demands of water supply, which requires keeping water in, and hydropower, which means releasing water out of Glen Canyon Dam. These decisions usually start to come into conflict in June, July, and August, but we've already started to see these decisions coming real-time in the middle of March. And now into April and now into May, what we're seeing is actually hydropower production has started to be curtailed. And so we're decreasing some of the hydropower production. We're decreasing to the lower Colorado River. And what we're going to see over the next few months here in the Colorado Basin is what climate change really looks like, of really, really hard decisions having to be made. And you're going to get to see it real time over the next 3 months as this crisis unfolds before us. So that's kind of a Western water snapshot. Now, whenever we think about water in America, 50-year types of plans, what does water look like? We inevitably have this mental image of a dam. Like this is what America did, was we built Hoover Dam, we built Glen Canyon Dam, we built the Tennessee Valley Authority and Grand Coulee Dam. This is the mental image that we have when we think about water resources. But in fact, over the past 50 years since that presidential commission got written, what we forget about is that the vast majority of water infrastructure built in the United States, in fact, the biggest building program of the Works Progress Administration under FDR was actually sewer treatment plants. Most of what we did during the Great Depression and afterwards, when we built water in America, it's actually it's the lowly water sewage treatment plant. And in fact, this is how most of us interact with water on a daily basis. We don't often work at a dam. We don't look at dams on a daily basis, but we use tap water and we use our toilets. And this is the basic infrastructure that goes into our daily lives. If we look at how much money we're actually spending, so this is how much total government spending, so federal government, state government, local governments all rolled together from 1956 to 2017 in constant dollars. What we see is on the left of this graph is water resources. So this is dams and levees and big stuff like that. And the most that we have spent was about $28 to $30 billion a year, and that was in the year 2001. If you compare that with how much money we've actually spent on water utilities, so drinking water and wastewater, water and sewer dwarfs it. So we spend more than $125 billion a year compared to only about $25 billion a year on our small water utilities. So again, there are a lot of them. They're very important. And this is where we're putting a lot of our money and a lot of our time and attention. In the same way that the Colorado River kind of reflects this crisis that's unfolding before us, what we've seen over the past 5 or 6 is what a crisis at the local level of a water utility plant looks like. And Flint was really kind of the one that caught the nation's attention. So Flint, we had a series of tragic decisions that were made locally by the state government as well. And it led to literally poisoned water that was being delivered to residents in Flint. The important thing to remember about Flint is that while it captured the nation's attention, it was not that unusual. Since the Flint disaster, we've also had Camden, New Jersey with a similar situation. Benton Harbor, Michigan actually occurred about 3 or 4 months ago, a very similar condition to Flint. And Jackson, Mississippi has almost a constant boil order going on in its city core as well for its drinking water system. So as much attention as we give these big Western dams, these lowly water utilities are incredibly important, and they're also starting to show their age as well. So I'm going to walk through what happened in Flint, what happened and why are we starting to see these kinds of crises unfolding. And I'm going to do the same thing that with Western Water. I'm going to take a really broad kind of national perspective, and I'm going to dig into the local level actually of Durham, North Carolina. So if we take a very broad perspective on the United States, what a colleague of mine, Lauren Patterson, a water data analyst, and I did was we pulled the census data and we grabbed every city in the United States or every community in the United States, and we used the census data to say when was the peak population of that community. And if the peak population was in 2018 or recently, we gave it a dark blue. If the peak population was 2010, it's a light blue and on. So anywhere that shows up blue, it basically means its peak population through time was recently. So its population is still growing. If the population shows up as dark red or even orange, what that means is that its peak population was in 1970 or even 1980. So if you kind of relax your eyes and kind of stare at this map for a little bit, what you start seeing is California is predominantly blue. The Pacific Northwest has a lot of blue. Florida has a lot of blue. But as you start to look into the Mississippi River Valley and go upstream to Illinois and Indiana, and especially into Western Pennsylvania and upstate New York, what you start to notice is a growing portion of red dots, red and scarlet dots. And what that means is that these places, their peak population was actually about 40 or 50 years ago. If we zoom into the upper Midwest and actually pull these dots apart a little bit, we start to see a little bit more spatial granularity, which should be somewhat intuitive. So if you look down in the bottom center of that, you can actually see down here is Cincinnati. So the center part of Cincinnati shows up as red, which means its peak population was in 1970, but the surrounding suburbs show up as blue. The same thing happens over to the northwest there in Chicago. The center part of Chicago has had a declining population while its suburbs have actually grown. The more concerning areas are places like Detroit, Pittsburgh over there to the east, and Cleveland, where it's not just that the center areas of the city have declined in population, but the suburbs have declined as well. I'm going to show you a red circle that's going to circle Flint, which is to the northwest of Detroit. And one of the things to notice is that Flint has declined, and so have the communities around it. So the overall regional population of Flint, Michigan has declined over the past 40 or 50 years. Now, if we do this across the United States, kind of get rid of geography for a little bit, on the horizontal axis is population growth. So if you're over to the right, that means that your community is growing. You're a dot. So Durham is somewhere on here. Durham is growing. So we're going to be over on the right. If you move over to the left, that means that your community is shrinking in population. And now vertically, we have the economic changes. So as you go vertically upward, that means that you're gaining in your city's income. And if you go downward, that means that your city has actually lost income. And what we're showing here, each one of these dots is a different city or community. If you're a blue dot, that means that your community is growing in size and also increasing its median household income for that community. So Durham sits way up on the right. We're growing here in Durham, North Carolina, and we're also increasing in median household income. But notice how many dots are way down there in the red. Those red dots are communities that have a declining population and also have a declining median income. So to the top right, getting bigger, getting richer. To the bottom left, getting smaller and getting poorer. And so what we're calling this is the great sort. So we're actually starting to shift our population into faster growing areas and richer areas and smaller areas and poorer areas. And this demographic shift is actually happening across the United States. So this fundamental assumption that this report in 1950 is based on, that we're going to have an ever expanding economy and that we're going to have a constantly improving standard of living, that fundamental assumption just is not true for all of these red dots. All of these red dots are places where the economy has not been improving, where the standard of living has not necessarily been improving. So we basically have these two Americas that we always hear about. This is actually what those Americas look like in terms of demography and median household income. If we dig into those a little bit more through a water lens, one of the things that we start to tease apart is that this demographic change has water implications. So if we take a place like Pittsburgh or St. Louis or Cleveland, these cities had their peak population in about 1970 or 1980. And that means that they built a lot of their water systems in the 1970s and 80s. Well, we're about 40 or 50 years later, which means that to keep those water systems intact is going to be more expensive. They have to spend more money on those. So if we look at St. Louis, what I've done is pulled the consent decree costs. And what the consent decree means is that the city of St. Louis has had a lot of water quality violations, whether for drinking water or for wastewater, and that the EPA has decided that they need to spend about $4.7 billion in St. Louis to bring their water systems into compliance. Now, in St. Louis, they've also lost about 50% of their city population, although the regional population has grown by about 11%. So St. Louis kind of has a population growth that they can depend on, but they have a very high sticker price that they need to go along with that. If you look at other communities like Cleveland or Pittsburgh or even Buffalo, New York, one of the things to notice is they have very high costs, $3 billion for Cleveland, $1.4 billion that they need to put into the Pittsburgh system. But they have to do that with a smaller population, not just in the city, but a smaller population in the region as well. So what this means is the costs are going up, the total population is going down. So each customer has to foot a bigger portion of the bill. And when you look at the actual demographics of these different communities, one of the things that we see is that the people who are staying in these communities, on average, have lower incomes than the people who have left. They tend to be more retired families, and they tend to be more people who work in the service industry who have a lower income as well. So what this means is that you have a higher bill, you have fewer people, and the people who have to pay for that higher bill tend to be lower income people as well. So we looked at a group of cities in Pennsylvania. We grabbed 25 cities or 23 cities in Pennsylvania that had declining population. And we looked at the annual rate of change of their water bill year on year. So the left graph, this is a box and whisker graph. The main line to pay attention to is that kind of dark line that's in the middle. The average one of these Pennsylvania cities saw its water bill increase by about 5.5% per year. In that same time period, inflation was about 2.5% per year. So the water bill was going up at about twice the rate of inflation. From 2010 to 2020, those same cities saw their water bills increasing at about 7.2% year on year. The rate of inflation during that time was only 2% per year. So water bills were increasing 3 times faster than the rate of inflation from 2010 to 2020. Now, one of the biggest complaints over the past 20 years has been the rising cost of higher education. For a sense of scale, the average rate of increase of Duke's tuition has been about 3.97% over these same 2 decades, which is about half the rate of the increase of water bills that have been in these same cities. So if you're a low-income household and you're in a shrinking city in Pennsylvania, your water bill is increasing faster than almost any other expense that you actually have compared to anything else from higher education to the food costs. Now, this was during a period of historically low rates of inflation. Now we're seeing 6-7% here in 2022. Almost all of the costs that are associated with a water bill are costs that are going to increase dramatically. So the primary costs that go into a water bill for a water utility to run are labor costs, which are going up dramatically, energy costs going up dramatically, and raw commodity, like basically things like cement and things like that. And what that means is that we are probably going to see water bills increasing even more rapidly, potentially upwards of 10 to 12% per year in the coming years as inflation increases as well. So this is one of the reasons why we see a lot of concern in the academic community about this issue of water affordability. When we talk about water affordability, what we're talking about is, can lower income households in a community afford to pay for their water and sewer bill? This has been a very big issue over the past 3 to 4 years in the research community. And a group of us at the Nicholas Institute at Duke joined forces with the Aspen Institute and held a roundtable series over the past 6 months. And in January of 2022, we put out a report that was a national strategy to ensure water affordability. And that kind of covers the issue. And it's just a resource that if you happen to be nerdy enough to be interested in water affordability, it's a resource that's out there. One of the other things that we did was we wanted to kind of go a little bit deeper than this kind of national scale kind of a view. And so Lauren Patterson, the water data analyst, and I have been pulling data from across the United States, and we've been putting that data into a dashboard, a user-facing dashboard. What I'm showing you are the states that we've made public so far. So if you're fortunate enough to live in one of the states that's on here, Jenny's going to put you a link that's going to give you access to that dashboard, and you can play around on it. But I'm going to show you how the dashboard kind of works and what it teaches us about what water affordability looks like at the local scale. So zooming into North Carolina, what we've done is look at the size of a water bill for a typical household, so using about 6,000 gallons a month, compared to the average income of low-income households within that community. So what we're able to do is, using census data, water bill data, and a lot of calculations sitting in the background, we can compare different cities, in this case across North Carolina. So we can see that Durham, on average, it shows up as light blue. Well, it's kind of Carolina blue sitting there in Durham. And what that means is that the affordability isn't so bad in Durham compared to if you go over towards Greensboro, which shows up a little bit brown. If you went to Duke Marine Lab down in Beaufort is this really small thing way down east that shows up as red. Beaufort actually has citywide, fairly unaffordable water for low-income households. So what we can do is we can start to use this data we can start to visualize how does affordability vary between these different communities. We can also then dig another level deeper, and we can pull the census data at basically the neighborhood scale, the census block scale. So we can say, within this one census block or this one neighborhood, what is the average household income? And then we can say how much of a water bill is actually, how much of a household's income is actually being consumed by a water bill. So we zoomed into Durham, and what we can see is that even though Durham overall has fairly affordable, or actually very affordable water, what we see is within Durham, patches or pockets of households and neighborhoods that are struggling with affordability, where they're spending, we'll talk about it in just a second, 1, 2, 3 days of labor for a typical family on paying just for their water and sewer bill. Now, one of the things that starts to come out, if you're familiar with Durham, is that there's a certain demographic geography to Durham. And if we map out this water affordability and we compare that with the spatial distribution, basically the racial distribution within Durham as well, one of the things that starts to stand out, we're just starting to look at this data, is in general, pockets of Durham that struggle with affordability are also the pockets of Durham that have predominantly Black and brown households. So we start to see this overlap of racial communities mapping on top of these different areas that struggle with affordability. We've looked at this across the United States. We don't have strong statistics on it yet, but we're just starting to play with it. But in general, across the United States, if you are Black, you spend more of your income on basic water services than if you are white. And this is all tied up in income, in household age, and a lot of other aspects of things. But when we just look at it through the water bill lens, this is a truth that keeps popping out at us, regardless of the state, regardless of the city that we actually look in. We then kind of scale back a little bit, and we tried to figure out a way to talk about water bills in a way that may resonate or communicate a little bit better. And what we ended up using was this days of labor metric. So we said, if you're low income, so if you're relying on minimum wage or somewhere near minimum wage, how many days of labor does it take to pay for a water and sewer bill? And so what we have here is, if it shows up in blue, so Memphis, Denver, Raleigh, Dallas, and Phoenix as examples, you work less than 1 day per month at minimum wage in order to pay for your water bill. The cities in yellow, Los Angeles, Portland, and Seattle, you work 1 to 2 days. And if you live in Washington, D.C. and rely on low income, basically minimum wage, or if you live in New Orleans, you're spending almost 2.5 days of labor on your water bill each month. There are some cities that show up as 3 to 4 days. And so whether a water bill is affordable is always going to be subjective, but these are some of the thresholds that we've started to suggest being able to look at. But one of the important things to take away from this is to compare the two ends of the spectrum here, New Orleans and Phoenix. Basic water services are far more expensive in New Orleans, one of the wettest places on earth, than they are in Phoenix, one of the driest places on earth. So there's often this idea that water is very expensive or water is very scarce in the desert, or it should be very expensive. And it's just not the case. Water is very secure in Phoenix. The overall water system is run in a certain way compared to the way it's run in New Orleans. And what we see is just that water's super cheap in Phoenix, Dallas, and even Denver, and it's fairly expensive in New Orleans, DC, and Seattle. So we're trying to figure this out. We're starting to map it around the entire US. We actually have built our database up to have 4,000 different utilities in it, so we can actually map this out over the entire US of how does water affordability actually map nationwide. So what is the future of America's water? What I'm going to do is try to give you two tools to use and to think about and to show off to your friends about how much you know about climate change, water, and affordability of water. And one of my favorites is this app that Jenny's going to post in the chat box as well. This came out of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And what the Fritz Lab developed was, what is climate change going to look like in a city 60 years from now? And it basically shows you your sister city. So in the case of Portland, Oregon, the climate in Portland, Oregon in 60 years is going to be what the climate in Sacramento, California is now. So if you want to know, if you want to live in Portland, Oregon in 60 years, go and visit Sacramento and kind of walk around a little bit and say, wow, I really don't like the climate here. Well, that's what it's going to be in 60 years. So Portland's going to look like Sacramento. Minneapolis is going to look a lot like Kansas City. Washington, D.C. is going to look a lot like Memphis. I ran the simulations for Durham, North Carolina. I ran 27 different simulations. There's a lot of variability, but the big red line there is the one to notice. And basically, Duke is going to have the climate of Florida State University in 60 years. And so that's what the climate change is going to look like. And in general, it's kind of interesting that the ACC is basically going to have the climate of the SEC over the next 50 years or so. So in general, it's going to get hotter and it's going to get wetter for the vast majority of cities that are in the mid-Atlantic. And all of us are going to start to look a lot like New Orleans, Tallahassee, Tampa, and Miami over the next few decades. So the other thing that we're seeing is demographically, we don't expect these demographic trends to actually change very much. The sorting that's actually going on, we expect to continue. In fact, one of the things that we're seeing is that higher income homeowners are tending to use less water than lower income homeowners because lower income homeowners tend to live in older homes that are less water efficient. And what that means is that higher income earners are going to use less water, spend less money on water, which means that the overall water bill for lower income households is actually going to increase. So this trend that we see of segregation, of economic sorting is probably going to be compounded on top of this overall water affordability trend as well. So it's going to be hotter and wetter, and it's also going to be more segregated. As we kind of look into the next 50 years or so, one of the things that I'm going to leave you with, whether it's for climate change in the Western United States or water affordability and water utility challenges in more of the Eastern United States, is the vision that this report had 75 years ago that we're still drawing on, is that the rise of water resources policy to meet ever-changing conditions is going to prove one of the great examples of the effectiveness of a democratic society in meeting the ever-changing needs of its people. And I think the challenge that we have, that I have, that certainly my students have for the next 50 years is when we see these kinds of trends starting to be proven out, what do we want for the next 50 years of our own communities and our own citizens? In the same way that 50, 75 years ago, they looked at the dry West and they said, we want to have something different. We're going to actually build infrastructure to provide that water. We're now seeing dry reservoirs and we're seeing low-income households struggle with water bills. do we actually want to, in this democratic society, do we want to implement change at a scale that would be necessary to actually start to turn things around from these trends that we're seeing? So with that, Jenny, thanks so much. And I would be happy to take some questions for a while.
Great. Thanks, Martin. I think while we're waiting for our audience questions to roll in, I'm just been asked to volley one up for you. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit too about the problem from the perspective of wastewater treatment, I think particularly for areas that are seeing a lot more rain and that still have combined sewer and wastewater. And we're seeing more rain, more volume in some areas where there is decreasing population or where those systems are dilapidated and haven't yet received funding for any new repairs. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that climate change aspect of when you add more water to the situation that you've already described.
Yeah, so what Jenny's describing is that we have a lot of water systems, they have what's called combined sewer or combined sewers. So basically sewage from your house is combined with runoff, and all of that water is usually pushed through the wastewater treatment system. That in general, that tends to be fine until we get very heavy rain events. And when those heavy rain events happen, it means that all of that water has to be treated. And it's extremely expensive. So a lot of the consent decrees that I showed you earlier, $3 billion in Pittsburgh, $4 billion in St. Louis, a lot of that is associated with these overflows that happen. As climate change is occurring, one of the main impacts of climate change is very heavy rainfall events. And so what that's doing is exacerbating these problems. The big thing that everybody's trying to do now is green infrastructure. So basically, can we use some innovative natural types of techniques as a way to decrease our reliance on traditional infrastructure? So DC and Portland have been two of the cities that have really gone after this most aggressively and probably the most creatively. I think that the verdict is still out on whether or not we can build green infrastructure at the scale that we actually need to do it. If we don't use green infrastructure, we build enormous reservoirs basically underground. So there's an enormous tunnel that goes underneath most of our major cities to store this stormwater. And so what we're trying to do is avoid those costs. So I think, Jenny, the answer is, can we actually use green infrastructure at scale? To be honest, I'm a little bit skeptical that we can use green infrastructure at the scale that's actually needed, but I hope we can.
Great, thank you. Our first question is from Jack Prommel. What role is the private sector taking when it comes to the racially segregated water system discrepancies?
Yeah, good question. So most of the water in the United States is provided from public water utilities. About 85% of water in the United States is from public water utilities. Private water utilities actually have a structural advantage over public water utilities. So private water utilities are actually able to do what's called consolidation. So they can actually combine multiple systems into one bigger effective system and actually control costs more effectively. So when we see these systemic challenges of declining population, unaffordable water, consent decrees happening, there's often a push to consolidate water systems. So basically a growing city absorbing or consolidating with some of these shrinking cities. That's actually really hard to do. What tends to be possibly an easier move is to privatize those systems and to basically allow the private sector to do it. It does increase costs, but it doesn't necessarily result in increasing costs across the board. So there is a way to basically improve equity through private water utilities. And they've been very creative in controlling costs for lower income households. So I think that the private sector is definitely part of the solution to some of these systemic challenges.
And I think this will tie into a little bit into this next question. Is there a correlation between high water rates and high system leakage?
The typical water utility loses about 12 to 14% of its treated water to leakage. And so every gallon of water that's lost to leakage is water that has been stored, transferred, treated, and delivered, that water utilities usually call this non-billable water because they've basically done all the services to make that water drinkable, but then they're not actually able to bill for it. So one of the ways that we're trying to improve affordability and to basically prove up systems is to improve, basically decrease leakage and to try to address that. These older systems do struggle a lot with non-revenue water or leakage. And so it's one of those things where if we can invest in that, it's a way to improve revenue from people who are actually using water and also mainly decrease the energy costs and chemical costs and the overall operational costs for the utility itself.
Great. Our next question is from Will Forney. He asked, economists suggest that water is underpriced compared to its true values to society, which is, I know, something we've all discussed in water finance in those classes. So despite the clear issues with environmental justice and equity, couldn't those price increases be considered a positive development in areas that can afford it or in those places where water is scarce?
This is such a sticky one for me because up until probably 2000 or 2005, the water sector generally was the biggest thing that we all talked about was the value of water. And we wanted to charge the real price of water. And we've really almost turned on a dime to where when we've charged the real price of water, it has really hammered low-income households. And some states, California is one of them, there's a few other states and utilities as well, they have statutes that basically say you can't cross-subsidize. So basically, you have to charge the same amount per gallon of water regardless of the income of the household. And what that means is that we have to charge everybody the same amount, which means poor households are going to pay the same per gallon as wealthy households. And so the real making water more valuable means that more of that revenue generation will be borne by the poorest households. I have not been able, this has been honestly the hardest research program that I've run in my career. I have not been able to think of a clever way out of the systemic challenge that we actually have on this one. It's way beyond me, which means that I need a 25-year-old to fix it for me. We need to figure out a different system than we have now. And I think that it is a creation of the system, not something that has not been managed well.
I know there have been other cities that have been experimenting with different rate structures depending on your income bracket. And I think unfortunately a lot of that's in a very experimental phase because it is such a complex problem. This next question is specifically asking about, I think referring back to a slide, Michael Whitman was wondering what climate model you used for the analysis that said Portland would become Sacramento. I believe SACR would be Sacramento. And then, so if it was a 1.5 degree increase, I'm not sure if that is something we might have to refer to the website for.
Yeah, I think I'd just refer you over to the website. So he has a whole lot of different options that you can run with the website on which climate scenario you actually run for it.
Great. And just gives you a reason to go play around with that tool. Norm Brown would like to know how well are systems in the Triangle area keeping up with infrastructure maintenance and updates in water and sewer systems?
Really well. So the big three of Raleigh, Durham, Raleigh has a system, Durham has one, and Chapel Hill is OWASA, Orange County Water and Sewer. Raleigh is actually one of the systems that did a really large-scale consolidation in the early 90s. So the city of Raleigh consolidated with a lot of the suburbs like Knightdale and some of the others as well. And they gained an enormous economy of scale by doing that. And so they've generally been way ahead of the curve in that sense. Orange County Water and Sewer Authority has been doing some incredible work in terms of data analytics. And so they have a crazy amount of data that they work with. So they've been very innovative. And I'm very proud of Durham. So they do a lot of really good stuff. And so all three of the systems have been very proactive in a range of different things. They've been willing to try things to stay ahead of the curve. And I think that that's reflected in the fact that we've got good water affordability, not great water affordability. And I think that basically shows that they're valuing water and investing in the infrastructure accordingly.
Karen Amen is wondering, here in Lincoln, the basic water needs per household are priced low, and then there are graduated levels of cost depending on the volume of water the household uses. Does a policy like this make sense nationwide or in other places?
Yeah. So Jenny, you could answer this question. This is called an increasing block rate structure. So one of the things that we also sometimes call it a lifeline rate structure. And basically you put a really low bill on that first, say, 2,000 gallons a month, and then you generate a lot of revenue from those additional ones. One of the things that's really good about that increasing block rate structure is that it can also create an economic incentive for conservation. It's kind of like your cell phone bill. If you have the more minutes you use, the more you pay, then you have an incentive to basically conserve. And so that's one of the better things about an increasing block rate structure. The problem that we see is that the households that start to get into some of those higher uses of water are actually, they tend to be older homes, and they tend to be homes with multiple children. So if you are a family, a parent, single parent, and you have 3 or 4 kids at home in a fairly old home that you may be renting, you start to use 8, 9, 10,000 gallons a month, then that increasing block rate structure has a strong penalizing effect on some of the households that we actually want to most assist. So there's trade-offs with any of these different rate structures that we try to do. Jenny mentioned one earlier that actually Philadelphia has tried. I think it's called the Tiered Assistance Program that they use, where they actually correlate, they use your income itself to figure out what your water bill is. So it's an income-based rate structure. That one's proven, as my understanding is that one has proven to be extremely difficult to actually implement. It's very complicated. There's a lot of information that's needed. And so the costs involved just implementing these programs can be very large.
A lot of moving parts to work through for sure. Joe Harris had a broad question about policy recommendations for these issues and asked also about more robust federal grants and loans through relating to the Clean Water Act. But I think this might be also a good opportunity to talk about state revolving funds and how they relate to this issue. So I'm going to kind of tee it up in that framework.
Yeah, good. So the infrastructure bill, the Biden infrastructure bill, included a pretty good, well, I mean, it sounds big. So it's in the order of about $50 to $65 billion was allocated for, or authorized and appropriated for water infrastructure. That's a big amount of money. But if the size of that is actually fairly small compared to the size of the need. The size of the need is somewhere in the order of 800 billion to $1 trillion. So the big challenge that the Biden administration is wrestling with right now is how do we allocate those fundings? Where the direction that they're going is through this program called the State Revolving Fund, which basically leverages. So there's some amount of money that comes from the federal government, and then the state does a matching program with that. And then often it's all leveraged as well with private finance as well. And so one of the things that the current administrator of the EPA, who runs the State Revolving Fund, Radhika Fox, is doing is she's actually targeting a pretty good amount of that federal money for affordability programs. So if a water utility or a city is applying for a state revolving fund loan from the federal government, if they can demonstrate that they have programs in place to help assist with affordability or with water conservation programs, then they are scored higher to get access to those federal funds. So other than these kinds of insertions from federal government or from state government subsidies, it's really unclear how we might address some of these failing systems otherwise.
And as you said, there's a lot of funding needed to spread out across the nation. Ethel Simonetti was hoping you could comment on assessments for impervious surfaces factored into our water bills.
This is a really clever thing that that some utilities have started to do is rather, often the way the bill works in Durham, and the bill typically works where I live in Hillsborough outside of Durham, is however much water you use, your drinking water, so if you use 5,000 gallons a month, we assume that that much water also goes into stormwater or goes into wastewater, and then we just kind of roll stormwater in with that. One of the things that we started to do is actually separate off stormwater and basically say larger lots or larger parking lots need to be effectively taxed in order to generate the revenue for basically stormwater treatment. And I think that this kind of pulling stormwater apart from the drinking water bill is, I think, really important, because It's more accurate. It's basically basically having different programs stay in their lane. And I think that this kind of segregation and appropriate use of revenue generation is the kind of thing that we need to do to get our arms around some of these problems.
Eloise had a question about whether there are any technological improvements in water treatment methods on the horizon that have the potential to reduce cost. She noted that developed countries stand out as doing an exceptional job in improving their water treatment and delivery costs. And is there anything that we can learn from the creative approaches that they've had to take?
Yeah, and I've just been skimming through some of these as well. And Ashok, he asked another question related to water shortages and scarcity. I think these actually kind of go together. The big two countries in terms of emerging water technology, there's always two that are at the top of the list. And it's always Israel and Singapore. And so the emerging technologies, the main emerging technology that we're seeing for water treatment is desalination. And so to the question of whether there's a risk that there's going to be real water shortages, in the places where we see genuine water shortage to the place where genuine scarcity is coming in, the running joke in the water sector is we can treat any water to any quality that we want given enough energy. Because basically desalination is pushing water through a membrane filter to basically clean it. So if it's really dirty water, so if it's saline water, we push it through and pull all those salts out. Countries like Israel and Singapore and some places in the Western United States, San Diego, a few places in Texas, have been increasing the use of desalination in order to ensure that they don't have these critical water shortages. But I think to one of these other questions about just how severe the water shortage might be, like we saw in Cape Town, like we saw in Madras a few years ago, I think that question is a very fair question to look at in August of this year. What we've seen in the past month is that the Bureau of Reclamation, which runs the big dams in the West, is not giving full allocations to the lower Colorado Basin. They basically cut allocations on the Klamath River Basin in California and Oregon. So you're basically seeing water not delivered to people who normally have water rights. And that's what the first kind of tranche of water scarcity is going to show. And I think over the long term, what the water shortages are going to trigger is an investment in these kinds of technologies, particularly desalination.
Elizabeth Green has asked about, I believe she's referring to the red zones that were decreasing in both population and income, whether those can be referred to as population saturation economies, and looking into the definition of poverty and its connection to various socioeconomic factors and overpopulation. And I guess I think she's wanting to look deeper into concept of poverty as it relates to this water issue.
One of the biggest challenges with any discussion about water affordability gets to some of the layers in her question, which is, in the end, it will be a values-based decision. So water affordability is based on how much water does a household need, how much is too much to pay. So the water sector has basically said 1 to 2 days of labor per month is a threshold. Well, that's a values-based decision. And 1 to 2 days of labor for 5,000 gallons a month. That's also a values-based decision that 5,000 gallons a month should be there. So I think anytime that we start to move into this area where we have to set up thresholds about how much is enough, how much is not enough, and where we start to lean into these issues of affordability and equity, there will not be an objective answer. All of our answers are going to be laden with values-based judgments. And I think that's where the reality of water, and hopefully if some of you have been through all of these different sessions, water is not an engineering field and it's not an economics field. It very quickly blends into sociology, it blends into the humanities, and some of the best conversations I've had on some of these issues have actually been with a professor over in the divinity school. These are issues of values and of morals and of like what we think society should provide to the poorest amongst us. And we will never get away from the values basis of that question in and of itself.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. And then Martin, if you want to include your final wrap-up thoughts in your answer to this. Ethel Simonetti was wondering how the increasing need for fighting fires these days, particularly in the West, interfaces with our water conservation goals and water use goals.
Wildfire season is 2 months early this year, so New Mexico is smoking away. So I think that in general, the amount of water that's actually used for fighting fires is not a big hit on the overall water system. There tend to be fairly separate things. Fighting fires within cities, it doesn't use a lot of water, but we have to build infrastructure in order to provide firefighting services. It's a little bit of a nuance that's there. But I think that what the fires are showing is the reality of 50 to 100 years of land management decisions that we've made that are now coming home to roost. Just like the drought on the Colorado River, the decline of Lake Mead and Lake Powell, and all of these. We were very innovative in 1950. We were very forward looking, but we could not have possibly imagined the changing context around us, both in terms of climate as well as the changing context of our socioeconomics. So if I'm going to leave you all with anything, it's that climate change is not the only thing changing that's affecting water and our natural resources. The demography is destiny. And I think that the changing demographics of the United States are as profoundly important for the future of our water as precipitation and temperature.